Welcome to the first episode in a series of 13 about the life and labors of Hercules. Before I get started on telling you about the most famous Greek hero, I'd like to tell you a little bit about how the ancient Greeks saw their own history. To make a very long story short, we know about 3 ages of ancient Greek history. There is the Bronze Age, when the first great empires fell before they suddenly collapsed due to a combination of wars and natural disasters. This led to the Dark Ages. We don't know very much about the Dark Ages, except that it wasn't a very nice time to live, unless you enjoy things like roaming bandits, famine, and not being able to write anything down. However, Greek civilization eventually recovered and began what we call the Classical Age. This is what we typically think of when we think about ancient Greek history, the time when the Greeks were exploring the Eastern Mediterranean, building their great temples, and of course worshipping the pantheon of gods led by Zeus. However, the Greeks remembered their history a little differently. They believed that the Greeks of the Bronze Age had been punished by Zeus for their impiety. They believed that the Bronze Age Greeks stopped praying, stopped sacrificing to the gods, so Zeus, being a tad miffed by this, sent a great flood called the Deucalion to punish the Greeks. This has parallels in the book of Genesis and its account of the flood, which only Noah survived. However, Zeus, much like God in the Old Testament, showed mercy upon the ancient Greeks, allowing one family to survive, and they repopulated the earth. However, when the flood waters receded, according to Greek mythology, it left many monsters behind that had to be killed before the Greeks could start a new age that involved something other than being eaten. Hercules is said to have lived around the end of the heroic age. It is also worth noting that another great Greek hero, Perseus, who is believed to have killed Medusa, would have lived a couple of generations before Hercules. In fact, his descendants were the rulers of the kingdom of Thebes, Hercules' hometown. Now, the kingdom of Thebes worshipped Zeus, of course. And when Zeus wasn't raining down lightning on his enemies, or receiving sacrifices, or fighting the Titans, he was probably seeking out female companionship. He was a shameless womanizer who sired dozens, if not hundreds, of illegitimate children. One of his many conquests was a woman named Alcmene, who was the wife of a great general of Thebes, Amphitryon. While Amphitryon was away, Zeus disguised himself as Amphitryon, went to Alcmene's bedchamber, and together they sired the child who would become known as Hercules. However, there was one person who objected to this romantic liaison, namely Zeus's wife and sister, Hera. Hera set out first to deprive Hercules of his inheritance. Under the rules of the time, the next-born son of the house of Perseus would get the throne. Hera went to Zeus and asked him to pledge that the next son born to the house of Perseus would become the next king. Assuming that next son would be Hercules, Zeus of course readily agreed. However, Hera then plotted with the goddess of childbirth to delay Hercules' birth long enough for another boy named Eurystheus to be born, and Eurystheus would become Hera's favorite, to become not only the king of Thebes, but to become the great hero who would rid the Greek world of monsters. However, that wasn't enough for Hera. Instead of being happy with disinheriting Hercules, she decided to murder him as an infant as well, and she sent 2 serpents to kill him in his bed. However, the infant Hercules, in the first of many heroic deeds, strangled these 2 snakes in his crib. And from that moment on, everybody knew that Hercules was going to be different, including his father Amphitryon. Amphitryon saw to it that Hercules had the best possible education. Amphitryon, of course, taught Hercules how to drive the chariot himself. Eurystheus of Oceania taught him archery. Autolycus, the king of Thebes, taught him wrestling, and Castor, who would become a hero of the Trojan War, taught him sword fighting. Unfortunately, despite this great education, Hercules stood apart from other boys because of his great strength. In fact, when he threw his lyre at his music teacher in a childish temper tantrum, because of his great strength, he accidentally killed his music teacher. And apparently, just like in the United States education system, if ancient Greek students assaulted their teachers, they were punished with a field trip. So young Hercules was sent out to the hills to keep watch over the king's sheep. Unfortunately, the king's sheep were being hunted by a great beast known as the Lion of Cithaeron. Hercules hunted this terrible monster in a search for 50 days before he finally tracked down the Lion of Cithaeron in his den and killed him. Not long after, Hercules was allowed back into Thebes, just in time to meet the emissaries of King Erginus. Erginus was the king of Crete. Now, going back to the Bronze Age, which we discussed earlier, Crete was the great superpower of the Greek world during the Bronze Age, and the kings of Crete are said to have become arrogant in their power and forced the city-states on the mainland to pay them tribute in gold, silver, slaves, animals, and anything else that struck their fancy. And this ancestral hatred for the island kingdom of Crete carried on into much Greek mythology, including the story of Hercules. When Hercules met the arrogant emissaries of King Erginus, who were demanding gold and silver and all other things shiny, Hercules responded by cutting off their noses, ripping off their ears, and chopping off their hands with axes. He then hooked their body parts onto ropes, which he draped around their necks, and declared that this would be the last tribute that any Theban paid to the king of Crete. As you can imagine, King Erginus was just a tad miffed about the mutilation of his servants, so he sent an army to punish the upstart Thebans. However, because the Thebans had a demigod in their ranks, they won the battle and their freedom from the tyranny of Crete. King Creon of Thebes was so grateful to Hercules that he married him to his daughter Megara. And by all rights, that should have been the end of Hercules' story. He had, according to the account, sometimes 2 children with Megara, sometimes 8. Sadly, he did not count on the obsessive hatred of Hera. Indeed, the ancient Greeks themselves would have seen Hera's preoccupation with Hercules as being completely irrational. After all, Zeus had dozens, if not hundreds, of illegitimate children running around the Greek world. And why Hera was so preoccupied with Hercules above all others is likely something that even she could not explain. And this shows us that in Greek mythology, the gods themselves could be just as stupid and irrational and hateful as any human being. So Hera came up with a truly malicious kind of torture. She sent Hercules a fit of madness when he was at the peak of his happiness, and in this madness, he believed that his 2 to 8 children had become snakes sent to kill him. So he took out his bow and arrow, and by the time that he came out of his madness, he realized that he had murdered all of his children and that his wife Megara was weeping in the corner. Hercules was overcome with shame and remorse and desperately wanted to be cleansed of this terrible crime. So he sought out the advice of the oracle at Delphi. So what is an oracle? An oracle was quite simply a priest who was a hotline to the gods. You could go in, you could ask them a question, and what they said was literally the god's answer. Now, how did the oracle ply her trade? Well, she would stand on a fissure in the middle of the temple floor, speak gibberish, and then the priests would write out answers and give them to whoever came to the temple. We actually know now that the fissure the oracle stood over was in fact seeping with natural gas. So one of the most important people in ancient Greek religion was basically a stoner who held people's lives and deaths in their hands. Let's think about that for a moment. Now, usually the oracle would give very ambiguous answers. One of the most infamous answers the oracle at Delphi ever gave was to the king of Lydia, who asked if he should go to war with the king of Persia. He was told that if he did, a great kingdom would be destroyed. He went to war assuming the Persians would be destroyed, and before he died on the battlefield, the king of Lydia realized that the oracle had actually been referring to his kingdom. Now, in the case of Hercules, the oracle's answer was crystal clear. He had to perform 10 labors for King Eurystheus, now ruling in Thebes. You might recall that Eurystheus was the child that Hera arranged to be born before Hercules. He since became Hera's favorite, and she hoped that he would become the great hero who would rid Greece of the monsters who had been left behind by the flood waters of the Deucalion. Well, and Hera then approached her favorite and told him that she wanted him to kill Hercules by assigning him impossible tasks to perform during his 10 years of service. Hoping to become the great hero of Greece, of course, Eurystheus happily agreed and proceeded to come up with labors that would surely cause the death of the great hero. And that is where we are going to pick up with the next podcast. This is the first in a series of 13 that will cover all of his labors. I wanted to thank you for joining me at Channel Legendarium. I hope you and yours have a great day, and I will see you soon. If you like what you see, please like, please subscribe, and I'd love to hear your comments in the section below.